It began on an ordinary Saturday afternoon when Sundar Pichai and his wife Anjali decided to step away from the fast rhythm of Silicon Valley life. They walked through the shining streets of Palo Alto, lined with stores that seemed to compete with one another for who could appear more exclusive, more untouchable, more perfect. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe, and the couple carried only one thought in their minds: to enjoy a quiet day, just the two of them without the weight of titles, meetings, or endless emails. No assistants, no cameras, no spotlight. Just Sundar, the man who had risen from modest beginnings in India, and Anjali, the woman who had stood beside him when his dreams were only fragile sparks waiting to catch fire. They stopped in front of a luxury boutique, the kind of place where the glass windows glittered like they held treasures rather than clothes. Mannequins stood tall in dresses worth more than the monthly salary of an ordinary worker. Anjali hesitated, her hand lightly brushing against Sundar's. She had never cared for status symbols, but she was curious, and in that moment she allowed herself to imagine trying on something different, something glamorous. Sundar smiled softly, his eyes reflecting warmth and patience. "Go inside," he said gently. "See what you like." She stepped through the tall glass doors, unaware that the next few minutes would wound her deeply. Inside, the store smelled of expensive perfume and polished leather. A saleswoman, tall and sharp-eyed, glanced at Anjali, then down at her simple handbag, then at the sandals on her feet. The look was quick, but it was enough to cut. The saleswoman's voice carried no warmth. "Can I help you?" she asked, though her tone suggested the opposite. Anjali replied politely, pointing to a dress on the display. "I'd like to see this one in my size." The saleswoman's lips curled ever so slightly. "That one is very expensive," she said. "Perhaps you'd like to look at something more affordable." The words hung heavy, coated in judgment. Anjali froze. She felt the flush of humiliation rising to her cheeks. She wanted to explain that she wasn't there to prove wealth, that her worth was not measured by the brand of her handbag or the glitter of her jewelry, but the saleswoman had already turned away, dismissing her presence as if she didn't belong. Sundar, watching quietly from the entrance, felt his chest tighten. He knew that look. He had seen it in classrooms when he was a boy in India, when teachers underestimated him because of his accent or background. He had seen it on the cricket field when richer children laughed at his shoes, which were worn and cracked. That same look of quiet rejection now struck his wife. The store grew colder for Anjali. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to hold on to dignity. She whispered, "Thank you, but I'll be leaving." The saleswoman shrugged, her eyes already sliding to another customer who walked in carrying a gold-stamped purse. As Anjali turned, Sundar reached for her hand. His touch was steady, grounding her. But behind his calm expression, his mind raced. He could walk away silently, as he had done many times in his life, or he could allow something different to unfold. The moment outside the boutique was heavy with unspoken feelings. Sundar didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply asked Anjali, "Are you all right?" She nodded, though her eyes glistened. She didn't want pity. She wanted respect. Sundar's gaze shifted back to the store. Every fiber of his being reminded him of the importance of humility, of kindness, of seeing people for who they are, rather than what they wear. But life had taught him that sometimes silence allows disrespect to grow stronger. Sometimes silence teaches others the wrong lesson. They walked slowly down the street, but the air was no longer light. Anjali's steps carried a weight, and Sundar's mind carried a storm. The rejection was not about money. It was about dignity. He thought of the many people around the world who faced quiet dismissals every day, in schools, in offices, in stores, and he felt the sting multiply. What if this moment could become something bigger than humiliation? What if it could be turned into a lesson about respect, the kind that reaches beyond polished glass doors and shiny clothes? But Sundar also knew something else. Life had a way of twisting when you least expected it. He glanced back at the boutique once more. He saw the saleswoman laughing with another customer. Her gestures exaggerated, her smile wide, her energy completely different. It was a performance, one that she had refused to give his wife. He tightened his jaw but said nothing. His silence was not weakness. It was patience, and patience in his life had always been a weapon. As they continued walking, a strange thing happened. A man in a simple shirt approached Sundar, recognizing him. "Are you Sundar Pichai?" the man asked in disbelief. Sundar nodded politely, not enjoying the attention but unable to deny his identity. The man's eyes lit up. "I just want to say thank you," he said. My daughter studies computer science now because she was inspired by your journey. Sundar smiled warmly and shook his hand. Anjali watched, her heart filling with pride. But in that same instant, something inside her shifted. She realized that the saleswoman in the boutique had no idea who she was or who her husband was. And yet she had judged so quickly. And now here stood a stranger who saw Sundar not for what he wore, but for the hope he carried to others. It was this sharp contrast, one of rejection and one of recognition, that planted the seed of what was to come. Sundar turned to his wife, his voice calm but filled with quiet strength. "This is not the end of the story," he said. And in his eyes there was a spark that promised change, a spark that hinted at something much larger than either of them could have imagined. And just as the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows on the street, Anjali asked, almost in a whisper, "What are you going to do?" Sundar paused, his silence stretching, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. And then, with a voice steady as stone, he said, "Sometimes the best way to answer disrespect is not with anger, but with a reminder of what true respect looks like." What he meant by those words, and what would happen next, would leave not just Anjali but the world around them utterly shocked. The silence before the storm, the evening after the incident at the boutique, was quiet. Yet inside their home the silence felt different. Anjali sat by the window staring out at the fading light, her mind replaying the scene again and again. She had always been strong, never easily shaken by judgmental looks or cutting words, but that day had left a mark. It was not about a dress, not about wealth, but about the way someone had looked through her as if she were invisible. Sundar noticed the way her shoulders slumped slightly, the way her eyes carried a weight that words could not explain. He walked to her, placing a cup of tea beside her, his presence steady but his mind restless. Memories stirred within him, memories he rarely spoke of. He remembered being a boy in Chennai, standing outside a small electronics store, his father's modest salary unable to buy him even the simplest gadgets. He remembered asking questions in school and being laughed at by classmates because his English was broken and his uniform was old. Those moments had shaped him, teaching him patience, teaching him to rise above, but also teaching him the sting of being judged before being understood. Now he saw that same sting in his wife's eyes, and it burned him in a way that success could not ease. As night deepened, the world outside their house glowed with streetlights, but inside the air was heavy with unspoken feelings. Sundar finally broke the silence, his voice low but certain. "You know, people see glass walls, polished floors, shiny handbags. They forget the real value of a person is not in those things." Anjali turned to him, her voice softer than usual. "I know, Sundar, but still, it hurt. It felt like I didn't belong." Her words cut deeper than she intended, because he knew too well what it meant to feel out of place in a world that measured worth in surface details. The next morning, Sundar sat at the breakfast table with his laptop open, yet his eyes were far from the screen. He was not thinking of code or meetings. He was thinking of a lesson. Not for the saleswoman alone, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small because of appearances. He did not want revenge. He wanted reflection. He wanted the world to pause and remember that kindness is the greatest luxury of all. As he stirred his coffee, a plan began to form. Quiet at first, like a whisper, but growing stronger with every heartbeat. Anjali watched him from across the table. She knew that look. The look he had when he was about to build something, when he was about to turn an idea into something powerful. She didn't ask him what he was thinking, not yet. Instead, she reached across the table, touching his hand lightly. And in that touch was both pain and trust. Sundar squeezed her hand gently, promising without words that what had hurt her would not remain only a wound. It would become something greater. Later that week, Sundar attended a leadership gathering, a room filled with CEOs, investors, innovators, all dressed in sharp suits and carrying the air of people who believed the world bent around them. Sundar sat quietly among them, his posture calm, his presence unassuming. When he spoke, people leaned in, not because his voice was loud, but because it carried weight. Yet even in that room, he thought of Anjali standing in the boutique, dismissed without a second glance. He wondered how many others in that very room had judged or been judged in the same way. That night, as he returned home, he found Anjali reading a book on the couch. She looked up and smiled, though her smile still carried traces of sadness. Sundar sat beside her and said quietly, "I think it is time we share a story. Not just ours, but one that can belong to everyone." She looked at him puzzled. "What story?" she asked. He answered with a calm certainty. "A story about respect, about humility, about how the smallest gestures can change the biggest lives." But before he could explain more, His phone lit up with a message from a close colleague. The words made his heart pound. Sundar, you need to know this. Someone from that boutique has been talking, and it's spreading faster than you think. Anjali looked at him, her eyes wide, searching his face for answers. He turned the phone toward her, and together they read the message again. What had begun as a quiet moment of humiliation was no longer just theirs. It was about to become something far bigger, something they could not yet see clearly. Anjali whispered, almost afraid of the answer. What does this mean for us? Sundar leaned back, his eyes narrowing with thought, his voice steady but filled with an edge of tension. It means, he said slowly, that the world is about to find out what really happened, and how we respond will change everything. Whispers in the Wind news has a strange way of traveling, faster than footsteps, faster than truth itself. What happened inside that boutique was small in time, lasting only minutes, yet it began to spread like a spark in dry grass. Someone who worked there had spoken, not with honesty but with exaggeration. The story twisted in retelling. The saleswoman did not admit she had dismissed a woman with quiet cruelty. Instead, she painted a tale where she claimed she had protected the dignity of her store from someone who clearly could not afford it. Those words, repeated in hushed gossip, found their way into social circles, into dinner conversations, and eventually into the glow of online posts. By the time Sundar heard of it, the story was no longer about one dress or one rejection. It was about status, pride, and false assumptions. Strangers who had never met Anjali laughed at the version they heard. Some mocked, some judged. Some spoke as if they understood the truth of a moment they had never witnessed. Sundar read the comments with a quiet stillness, but inside him a storm brewed. He had faced criticism before, about decisions at Google, about technology, about leadership. But this was different. This was not about him as a CEO. This was about his wife, the woman who had stood by him long before the world knew his name. Anjali tried to brush it aside. She told him gently, "Let it pass, Sundar. People will move on." But Sundar shook his head. When disrespect is left unchallenged, it teaches others that it is acceptable. I will not let this moment teach the wrong lesson. His words were calm, but beneath them was a deep resolve. Anjali saw it in his eyes. The same resolve she had seen years ago when he left India with little money and a scholarship, determined to build a new future. The following day, Sundar walked into his office not with thoughts of algorithms or strategy, but with a story forming in his mind. He remembered his childhood again. The small house in Chennai with its crowded rooms, the smell of his mother's cooking, the long nights studying under dim light. He remembered walking miles to get to school, not because it was required, but because he wanted to learn. Those memories filled him with humility, a humility that had never left him even as the world called him CEO. And he thought of Anjali, who had chosen to walk beside him when he had nothing, who had believed in him when success was only a distant shadow. He realized the story was not about the boutique at all. It was about something much larger. How society measures worth, how people treat one another, how respect should never be limited to those who wear wealth visibly. He began to draft words, not as a press release, not as a defense, but as a message to the world. Every human being, he wrote, deserves dignity. You do not need a title, you do not need luxury. You do not need fame to be worthy of kindness. If we lose this truth, we lose ourselves. As he wrote, his phone buzzed again. A journalist had caught wind of the gossip and wanted his comment. Sundar stared at the message. He knew that if he remained silent, the false version of events would grow stronger. But if he spoke, the story would burst into a fire much larger than he could control. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, "Sometimes the fire must burn to show the light." That evening, he shared the draft with Anjali. She read it slowly, her eyes moving over every word. When she finished, tears welled up, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of something deeper than she could say. "This isn't about me, is it?" she asked softly. Sundar shook his head. "No. It's about everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. You are simply the mirror that showed me the truth." They sat together in silence, knowing that once those words left their home, they could never be taken back. They would either heal or divide, inspire or inflame. Sundar reached for her hand once more, steady and certain. "Whatever happens," he said, "we will face it together." But as the night grew darker, a message arrived from a source Sundar did not expect. It was not from a journalist, not from a colleague, but from someone inside the boutique itself. The message was short, trembling, almost fearful. "I know what really happened. and you deserve to know the truth about her. Anjali looked at Sundar, her heartbeat quickening. The truth about who? She whispered. Sundar read the message again, his eyes narrowing, his voice dropping low. The truth, he said slowly. About the woman who rejected you. Behind the glass door, the message from the boutique lingered in Sundar's mind like a whisper that refused to fade. You deserve to know the truth about her. Those words echoed again and again. Who was this anonymous voice, and what secret were they hinting at? Anjali sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes filled with unease. She had already endured the sting of rejection. She did not want to carry more shadows in her heart, yet something inside her told her that this was not random. Life had a way of revealing what people tried to hide, and sometimes the truth came in moments one least expected. The following morning, Sundar received another message from the same unknown number. This time it was longer. The sender claimed to be an employee who had overheard a conversation inside the boutique after Anjali left. According to them, the saleswoman who had humiliated Anjali was not acting out of simple arrogance. She had a personal story of her own, one that explained her bitterness, her sharp words, and her judgmental eyes. If you knew where she came from, the message read, you might see her differently. Anjali was torn when she read it. Part of her wanted to dismiss the entire matter, to walk away from the pain and never think of it again. But another part of her was curious, almost against her will. She wanted to understand why a stranger could look at her and decide she was unworthy. Was it cruelty or was it something deeper? Sundar noticed her conflict and spoke softly. Sometimes people hurt others because they carry wounds of their own. Maybe we should listen before we decide. That evening, Sundar arranged a quiet meeting. He did not want cameras. He did not want attention. He simply wanted to hear the truth. Through his network, he was able to reach the employee who had sent the messages. They met at a small cafe tucked away from the main streets, where the hum of voices blended into a safe cover for their conversation. The employee was nervous, glancing around as though revealing a dangerous secret. The saleswoman, the young man said. Her name is Mira. She wasn't always like this. Years ago, she lost everything. Her family, her savings, her home. She came to this city to rebuild, but instead of kindness, she found doors closed to her. People looked down on her, just as she looked down on your wife. She learned the wrong lesson, that to survive she must act cold and superior. Anjali listened quietly, her heart conflicted. She had been deeply wounded by Mira's behavior, yet hearing this softened her anger. Pain recognizes pain. She thought of the times in her own life when she had struggled, when others had underestimated her, when she had been invisible in rooms filled with louder voices. Perhaps Mira was trapped in her own invisible prison, building walls of arrogance to hide her scars. Sundar, however, felt a different storm within him. He understood the explanation, but he could not excuse the cruelty. Life is unfair to many of us, he said firmly, but that does not give us the right to tear others down. Her wounds may explain her actions, but they cannot erase the hurt she caused. His voice carried both compassion and steel. The employee leaned forward and whispered, there is more. The boutique owners know her past. They use it against her, reminding her she is replaceable. She lashes out at customers not because she believes she is better, but because she fears being seen as less. She hides her fear with arrogance. The revelation left both Sundar and Anjali silent for a long time. The problem was no longer about one dress or one moment. It was about something larger. How society forces people to perform roles, to wear masks, to hide their brokenness behind false pride. As they left the cafe, the night air was cool and the streets were almost empty. Sundar turned to Anjali and said quietly, we stand at a crossroads. We can expose her and let the world judge her as she judged you. Or we can choose another path, one that teaches a lesson without destroying a life. Anjali's eyes met his, filled with both pain and compassion. What path do you see? She asked. Sundar looked ahead, his jaw tight, his mind racing with possibilities. Just then, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't from the anonymous employee. It was from a well-known journalist who had been following the whispers about the incident. The message was direct. I know about what happened in the boutique. Tomorrow I'm publishing the story with or without your comment. You should decide how you want to be seen. Anjali's breath caught in her throat. This was no longer a private matter. The story would go public, and once it did, the world would not just judge the saleswoman, it would judge them too. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with a quiet determination. "The world wants a story," he said. "Then we will give them one. But it will not be the story they expect." Anjali stared at him, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" she asked. Sundar's gaze was steady, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had made his choice. "I will not fight arrogance with arrogance. I will show them that true strength is measured in humility. But to do that, I must do something that will shock everyone." And with those words he began to outline a plan so bold, so unexpected, that even Anjali felt a chill run through her as she listened. She realized that the next chapter of their lives would no longer belong only to them. It would belong to everyone who heard the story. The weight of every eye when the article finally appeared, it spread faster than even Sundar had imagined. What began as a small spark in a boutique now burned across screens around the world. The headline was bold, crafted to draw both sympathy and outrage. "The wife of Google's CEO humiliated at luxury store." Beneath the headline, the journalist detailed the encounter, adding flourishes of drama and framing it as a story of class, wealth, and dignity. But what shocked readers even more was not the gossip itself, but Sundar's response. Instead of anger, instead of threats, instead of lawsuits, he had released a statement that spoke of humility, kindness, and the need for respect in every human interaction. The words were simple, yet they cut through noise like a quiet truth that refused to be ignored. "My wife was not hurt because of a dress," the statement said. "She was hurt because someone forgot to see her as a person. Respect should not be a luxury. It should be our first gift to one another." The message was shared millions of times. Some praised his restraint, some questioned his choice, and others confessed that they had been guilty of the same silent judgments in their own lives. But not everyone was pleased. Within the boutique, whispers grew into panic. Customers called angrily, some canceling memberships, others demanding apologies. The owners feared for their reputation, while Mira, the saleswoman, found herself at the center of a storm she had not expected. Her arrogance had been a shield, but now it crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Every glance she received on the street felt sharper. Every conversation around her seemed poisoned with her name. She had tried to hide her fears behind polished words, but the world had exposed her, and now she was left standing bare. Sundar and Anjali, however, faced a storm of their own. They could no longer walk unnoticed through the streets. Reporters gathered near their home, cameras waiting to capture even the smallest expression. Invitations to speak on talk shows flooded in. Requests to turn the incident into a larger debate on class and culture. Sundar declined them all. He knew that the more he fed the fire, the less control he would have over the lesson he wanted the world to learn. But every refusal only made the press more desperate, more determined to pry. Anjali, caught in the middle, struggled quietly. She had never asked for this attention. She had only wanted to browse a store, to live a simple moment. Now her face was printed across newspapers, her name attached to discussions about wealth and privilege. Strangers wrote to her, some kind, sharing their own stories of rejection, and some cruel, suggesting she had brought it upon herself. She read them late at night when Sundar was asleep, her heart heavy with questions. Had her pain helped others feel less alone, or had it only turned her into a symbol she never wanted to be? One evening, as they sat together in their living room, the weight of it all pressed down harder than before. Sundar noticed the tiredness in her eyes, the way she rubbed her temples as if trying to push away the noise of the world. He leaned closer and said softly, "You do not have to carry this alone. I will carry it for both of us." But Anjali shook her head, her voice trembling. "This is not about me anymore, Sundar. This is about everyone who has ever been judged. I just don't know if I'm strong enough to be their voice." Sundar took her hand, steady and warm. "You already are. Strength is not about never feeling pain. It is about standing even when pain is heavy, and you are standing." His words brought a small tear to her eyes, but also a fragile smile. Yet even as they found comfort in one another, the storm outside was shifting. A letter arrived at their home, written not by journalists or strangers, but by Mira herself. The envelope was simple, her handwriting uneven as though written in haste. Inside, the words poured out like confession and plea all at once. She admitted her behavior, admitted her fear, admitted the hollow life she had built around arrogance. She wrote, "I am sorry for the pain I caused. I judged because I was afraid of being judged. I hurt you because I could not face my own hurt. Now the world hates me and I do not know how to live with it." Anjali read the letter aloud, her voice soft, her hands trembling. Sundar listened, his face unreadable. When she finished, silence filled the room like heavy smoke. Anjali looked at him and whispered, What do we do now? Sundar leaned back, his eyes deep in thought, his breath slow. Now, he said, the real test begins. Anyone can fight back with anger. But can we answer brokenness with mercy? Anjali stared at him, uncertain. Mercy, she repeated, the word tasting strange on her tongue. Sundar nodded slowly. Yes, because if we cannot show her what respect truly means, then everything we said, everything we stood for, becomes just words. But before they could decide their next step, another message appeared, this time not from Mira, not from a journalist, but from a powerful figure in the luxury world, warning them to stay silent. You don't understand, the message read. This is bigger than one store. If you keep pushing, you'll uncover things that powerful people don't want revealed. Anjali looked at Sundar, her heart racing. What could be bigger than this, she asked. Sundar's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. That, he said quietly, is what we are about to find out. The last reflection, the warning hung in the air like a storm cloud. This is bigger than one store. Sundar read the message twice, then placed the phone on the table. Anjali watched him carefully, sensing the weight behind his silence. She had seen him calm in boardrooms filled with billion-dollar negotiations. She had seen him patient in the face of criticism. But this silence was different. It was the silence of a man piecing together a puzzle whose edges were far darker than expected. The next days unfolded with strange tension. Whispers emerged about luxury chains, about how they trained their staff not to welcome everyone, but only those who looked like buyers. Behind polished doors, a quiet system thrived on judging worth by handbags, watches, and accents. The boutique incident, it turned out, was not an isolated act of arrogance. It was a symptom of something deeper, something hidden yet woven into the culture of exclusivity. The message had been right. This was bigger than one woman, bigger than one store. Sundar felt a crossroads rising before him. He could remain quiet, protect his family from the storm, let the story fade as so many stories do, or he could step into the fire fully, exposing not just Mira's actions but the system that had shaped them. Anjali saw the conflict in his eyes and placed her hand on his. Whatever you choose, she said softly. Remember this, our goal is not to punish. Our goal is to heal. Then came the moment that would test them both. A conference had been arranged, one that Sundar was scheduled to speak at. The audience would include leaders from technology, finance, and luxury industries. The world was already watching, waiting to see if he would use the stage to strike back. Anjali sat in the front row that day, her heart pounding as Sundar walked onto the stage, the lights bright, the cameras ready. He stood there tall and calm, his presence commanding not because of power but because of the quiet truth he carried. He began not with the boutique, not with the gossip, but with a story. He spoke of his childhood in Chennai, of the cracked shoes he wore to school, of the small home filled with love but never filled with wealth. He spoke of being underestimated, of being dismissed, of knowing what it feels like to be invisible. Then he spoke of Anjali, of the moment in the boutique when she was treated as less than human, and of the millions around the world who faced such moments every day. The room was silent, every breath held as his words sank deep.